Hello and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. Now, this video is not quite like videos I've done previously. Yes, I'm sitting here talking, of course, but this video is actually being made by request. I was requested to make it by my good friend Lily, who suggested the woman who is the subject of it as someone who deserves to be better remembered than she is. A remarkable woman who became one of the most powerful rulers in Europe during the 10th century. A woman whose strength and determination I greatly admire, but a woman who is very largely overlooked when people are compiling lists of great women, or indeed lists of great rulers of either sex, since she more than deserves to be included in both of them. Sadly, when she is mentioned, it is almost always in connection with a series of very unpleasant events in which she was involved. Events that do not show her true character. They are what today we would see as someone pushed to the limit by circumstances and snapping under pressure, if you like. A reaction not typical of the person and never again repeated during their life. To judge her only by those events is not only unfair to the memory of a very remarkable woman, but also a distortion of history. So I'm delighted to do this video, set the record straight, and thank you very much, Lily, for suggesting it. Throughout history, there have been some great female rulers, easily the equals, and sometimes superior to the great men of ages past. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, Ethelred of Mercia, the Lady of Mercia as she was known, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Boadicea, Queen of the Iceni, Hatshepsut, fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of Egypt, Tsarina Catherine the Great of Russia, to name but a few. In this video, I'm looking at another great female ruler. A woman who could claim not only to be the equal of any man as a powerful ruler, but to surpass most of them when it came to inflicting her revenge on those who had harmed her. I find her personality quite fascinating. A very good, decent, and loving woman, but that same love could drive her to unleash a fury worthy of Tamerlane, Genghis Khan, or Vlad the Impaler. Yet her rule over her people was very good. She introduced reforms, she strengthened trade, she improved the lives of her subjects, and she was supported by them. She was a popular ruler. And she actually became a saint. Yes, a saint. Halo. Oh yeah, a saint. You know, just don't piss her off, or, well, you would be very sorry. Her name was Helga. Her family was Swedish, and she was born sometime around 890 AD, though it could have been a little later, in Pskov, which is today in northwestern Russia. In the East, a Slavic language, her name became Olga, and she is known today as Grand Princess Olga of Kiev, ruler of the Kievan Rus as regent from 945 to 960 AD, and also as Saint Olga, venerated by both the Eastern Orthodox Church and some Roman Catholics, though for much of her life she was a pagan, devoutly following the Norse and Slavic gods. Like all early Rus rulers, her emblem was the bident, which is a form of spear similar to a trident, but having only two prongs. Well, hence its name, though the shape of it varied slightly from ruler to ruler, and in its ceremonial form it might actually resemble a trident, since there is an ornamentation that comes up between the two prongs. Now, the Rus originated in Sweden and Gothland during the 9th century. Vikings coming to the east and taking control over a large area of what is now Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine. And in fact, it is from them that the names Russia and Belarus derive, the term Rus actually coming from a word that meant to row a boat. And of course, it's obvious where they got that from. They were a fairly small ruling elite rather than a population shift. They held power, but they didn't bring thousands and thousands of other Norse people with them and supplant the local Slavic population. And in fact, they were actually invited by the local people to come and establish order. That's not something that's happened very often in history. The Tale of Bygone Years, which is one of our principal sources of information about these early times, compiled in Kiev circa 1113 AD, and often referred to as the primary chronicle, tells us that the local tribes were fighting among themselves. War had broken down, and eventually some of the leaders grew tired of it, and they decided to turn to Scandinavia for help in 862 AD. It states, "They said to themselves, 'Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law.' And accordingly they went overseas to the Varangian Rus. And there they said to the Rus, 'Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us.' Thus they selected 3 brothers with their kinfolk, who took with them all the Rus and migrated. 2 of the Swedish Viking brothers actually died, but the third established himself as ruler in the new land, and the Vikings began to assimilate very quickly, eventually becoming just as Slavic as they had once been Scandinavian, and ruling over the mostly Slavic population of their realm. The Scandinavian origin of the Rus is independently confirmed by one Lucius, the Bishop of Cremona, who had dealings with them while acting as an envoy to the Byzantine Empire during the 10th century, referring to them as Russi, who we call Norsemen by another name. That surviving brother was a man named Herorical, and he arrived initially in the town of Stalia Lagoda. And then he went on to build the city of Novgorod in the same year, establishing himself there as ruler. To the Slavs, he was known as Rurik, and he established the so-called Rurik dynasty, the Rurikids, or the sons of Rurik. And they would hold power across Russia, including the later Grand Duchy of Moscow, as well as the Tsardom of Russia, until 1613, when they were replaced by the Romanovs, who of course ruled Russia down to the Communist Revolution during World War I. Grand Prince Rurik died in 879, entrusting the care of his son, Prince Ingvar Roriksson, or Igor to the Slavs, to a man named Oleg of Novgorod, who may have been a fellow Swedish prince or even Rurik's brother-in-law, we really don't know. And he ruled until Igor was old enough to take the throne. And it was Oleg who moved the capital of the kingdom to Kiev, in modern-day Ukraine, which became the center of the powerful Rus Empire. Eventually, Igor took the throne as Grand Prince Igor I, and he married the subject of this video, Olga. The couple having a son named Svatoslav, who would later become Grand Prince Svatoslav the Brave. Now, before I go any further, the Kievan Rus. Well, we call them the Kievan Rus, but they never used that term, nor did anybody else at that time. In fact, it was only coined during the 19th century by a Russian historian. And they were simply the Rus, which could refer to the people themselves or to the land. Rus coming to mean the land of the Rus as well as its inhabitants. In Norse accounts, the region was known as Gardiake. We know nothing about Olga, apart from the obvious fact, of course, that she was born prior to her marriage to Igor, though following that she left a considerable footprint on history, though not perhaps a particularly good one in some respects. But she must be seen in the context of why, especially in view of her later quite excellent rule over her realm. And there is a parallel between her and Boadicea, since just as the great queen of the Iceni was driven by the pain and humiliation she suffered at the hands of the Romans to commit some pretty nasty deeds, contrary to her previous behavior, so too Olga was driven by the love of her husband and her desire to avenge him, causing her to do things she would never have done otherwise, since in other respects she was fair and just, as we shall see. In the year 945 AD, Grand Prince Igor traveled with a considerable military force to the city of Iskorosten, modern-day Korostan in northern Ukraine, to levy the tribute he considered due to him from the Drevlians. Now, the Drevlians, they were a local tribe who had previously paid tribute to the Rus, and they'd even joined them in various military campaigns. But on the death of the previous ruler, they decided, well, their obligations had died with him, and no tribute had been forthcoming for some years. Now, Igor didn't agree. Tribute was due, considerably overdue, in fact, and he wanted it. Now, the Drevlian leader, one Prince Moll, was not, he was not overly enthusiastic about paying up, but given the size of the Grand Prince's escort and the fact that he kind of liked his head where it was supposed to be, on his shoulders, discretion was the better part of valor, and he handed over the requested tribute. Now, that was fine. Tribute was paid, reluctantly of course, but paid nonetheless. And history would be completely different had Igor simply returned with it to Kiev. But on the way back, now he'd a bit of a think about it, and he decided that he'd been underpaid. He'd been too lenient with them, especially after them not giving any tribute for years and being allowed to get away with it, year after year after year, giving nothing to Kiev, and he deserved a larger amount. Of course he did. Interest, you might say, on the unpaid tribute. So he turned back to get what he was due. But he only took a small detachment of his men with him, sending the main body on with the tribute already collected to Kiev. That was a very big mistake. Instead of handing over more tribute, Prince Mal gave himself a tax rebate, you might say, by simply killing Igor. The Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon, who wasn't actually born at the time, describes the gruesome event thus. They had bent down 2 birch trees to the prince's feet and tied them to his legs. Then they let the trees straighten again, thus tearing the prince's body apart. Half of Igor going in one direction and the other half going the opposite way. Now there has been doubt cast as to the truth of that story, since the tale of bygone years is not always totally reliable as to facts, sometimes embellishing them a bit or contradicting other accounts. And Leo the Deacon didn't come into the world until 5 years after the event. But whether he found himself in 2 places at once, or just got his head lopped off, or something sharp shoved through his guts, it is an established, unquestioned fact that Grand Prince Igor was dead. But then the Drevlians, pleased with themselves, of course, at avoiding paying any more tribute, made a decision which must rank as one of the worst decisions in history, and one of the hardest to understand. Olga's marriage was not simply the usual loveless, politically arranged union so common among royalty, where alliances and treaties meant more than a couple's personal happiness. No. She clearly loved Igor. She loved him very much. And her love for him was a factor they rather overlooked. And it was that would alter the course of history. They had no idea that they were just about to wake a sleeping giant. Since Sviatoslav was only 3 years old, and thus hardly fit to rule anything more than a playpen, Olga would ascend the throne of the Rus as Grand Princess Regent, with all the powers her husband had held. But she was a woman, and in that the Drevlians saw their opportunity. Since she was just a mere woman, and thus obviously in need of a man to take control and show her how things like ruling a country were done. Things that as a woman she wouldn't understand, obviously. The Drevlians decided what a good idea it would be to offer her a new husband to replace the one she'd just lost. Well, I mean, it was the least they could do, since they were the ones who killed him. And what better choice than Prince Mal, since he had ordered the murder. And that seemed to make him the perfect choice as replacement husband. I mean, it was so obvious. He'd ripped her husband in 2, spread his guts across the countryside. Well, clearly the widow would fall madly in love with him at first sight. Yes, the fact that such an offer might not go quite that way, that it could possibly be seen as, rather lacking feeling for the widow's grief, for example, that never crossed their minds. And in fact, they didn't just suggest it, they actually announced it as a matter of accomplished fact, sending a party of 20 men to inform Olga that firstly, they just murdered her husband, and secondly, to tell her of her good fortune, that a new husband had already been found for her. No need to look elsewhere. They had done it all just for her. How nice of them, Perhaps that might actually have worked with some royal widows of those days. Girls who had been married off to men often far older than they were, or betrothed as young children, sometimes even meeting their husbands for the first time at the altar on their wedding day. Well, a woman like that might have said, well, he didn't love me, I didn't love him. This one might be better. That is possible. But, if that was the Drevlian mindset, they got it very wrong indeed. The delegation sailed down the river Dnieper, and they gave Olga first the bad news. Her husband had been killed by Prince Mal. And then the good news. Her husband's murderer, in an act of great kindness, was now going to marry her. And they were there to take her back to Iskar to her prince who awaited her. Olga's reaction was nothing short of magnificent. Many people would have been hysterical at such news, sobbing uncontrollably, distraught, unable to even get their mind around such a thing. But not Olga. Her intelligence and her cunning overcame her grief. She was calm, and she was thinking ahead, something they clearly were not. She is quoted as saying, "Your proposal is pleasing to me. Indeed, my husband cannot rise again from the dead. But I desire to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Return now to your boat and remain there with an aspect of arrogance. I shall send for you on the morrow. And when you come, you shall say, 'We will not ride on horses nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat, and you shall be carried in your boat.'" The sarcasm, of course, went right over their heads. And they duly returned the next day, telling the assembled people the words Olga had told them to say. They were delighted by the eager response of the citizens of Kiev. The people taking their boat out of the river, they got into the boat and they were borne aloft like royalty, as though in a palanquin, carried in great style, as befitted, of course, the important ambassadors they were on their mission of profit, love, and goodwill, and happy marriage ahead. Carried into the royal court, no less. But then the people stopped beside a great trench that had been dug the previous evening on the orders of the Grand Princess. And they tipped the boat over, dropping the delegation into the trench, which was quickly filled in with earth, burying the men alive, there to suffocate to death. Olga was said to have leaned down as the men were buried and called down to them, "Do you find this honor to be to your taste?" Their reply isn't recorded, I'm afraid, as far as I know. Possibly because it was somewhat muffled by a few tons of earth. But Olga was only just getting started. Oh, yes. She dispatched a messenger to the Drevlians, saying that she wished to go to her husband, her love, the Prince Mall, with the honor due to him, asking that they send their most distinguished men, those most responsible for the running of their realm, to meet her in Kiev, so she could return with them to Iskorost to meet her prince, her love to be, in the style he deserved. They, of course, had no idea that the previous delegation were now incorporated into the palace garden, their envoys having become a garden feature, you might say. And they promptly dispatched what were described as the best men who governed the land. Olga greeted the men with a warm welcome, quite literally, as it happened, ordering her servants to prepare a bath for the delegation, no doubt dusty and sweaty from their journey, telling them to bathe themselves, and when they were bathed and refreshed, she would meet them afterwards. So they all trooped into the bathhouse, the doors of which were then locked and the building set on fire, burning them all to death, as Olga listened outside to the, sound effects, shall we say, emanating from within. Now with that, she had all but eliminated the Drevlian ruling class, but she wasn't finished yet. She was just getting into her stride, and her stride was a mighty one. Oh, this was not some timid little woman who meekly did as she was told, as the Drevlians clearly expected her to be, thinking her to be the typical male-dominated princess under the thumb of a man. They would soon find themselves under her thumb, and it was a very large thumb. Another messenger was dispatched to Iskorost, telling the Drevlians the words of the Grand Princess. "Prepare great quantities of mead in the city where you killed my husband, that I may weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast in his honor." And that they did. Olga arrived, accompanied by a small and obviously non-threatening group of retainers. And they went to Igor's grave, and right enough, she wept copiously and held a funeral feast as she had stated she would. That part of her message had been true enough. The Drevlians joined in. No reason to miss a good feast. And for some reason, they didn't seem to find the absence of anyone from the two delegations they'd sent to Kiev to be just a bit odd. Olga having apparently left them all behind for some reason, despite her previously stated intention of returning with them, which was the reason they'd all gone to Kiev in the first place. Yet not even one of them had returned with her. That should have told them something. But I suppose people who think that telling a widow she's going to marry her husband's murderer is a great idea probably aren't very smart. Anyway, the Drevlians were liberally supplied with drink. "Oh, your cup's empty. Here, let me fill it for you, right up to the brim again," sort of thing. When they were all well inebriated and lying around pretty much helpless, Olga ordered her followers, who were surprisingly sober for some reason, apparently they were all teetotalers, they hadn't drunk anything, she ordered them to kill the Drevlians. And she herself went around personally supervising the slaughter to make sure they didn't miss anybody, which, according to the tales of bygone years, resulted in 5,000 Drevlians being killed. So, was that the end of it? Was Olga now satisfied with the revenge she had had upon the Drevlians? Oh, no. No, she wasn't done yet. Returning to Kiev to assemble her army and finish the job once and for all. The full pent-up anguish fury of Grand Princess Olga was about to be unleashed upon the Drevlians. I almost feel sorry for them. Well, yeah, little bit. She led a strong Rus force into battle against the Drevlians, soundly defeating them and driving them back into their various towns, demanding tribute or death from them. And they, knowing now of her previous actions, wisely choosing the tribute option. By that time, I'm sure just the mere sight of her Bident banner was enough to get compliance from most people, or at least those of them who wanted to live a bit longer. Then she marched on to Iskor-Rostan, which did resist her, no doubt fearing an extra degree of wrath from her as the place where her husband had been murdered, and that forced her to lay siege to the city. But its defences were strong, and the siege lasted for a whole year without any result, becoming a stalemate. Ever resourceful, Olga came up with a plan, one that really showed her genius. She sent a message to the city, a very conciliatory and really rather nice message, very considerate, in fact, given the circumstances. People of Iskor-Rostan, why persist in holding out? All your cities have surrendered to me. They have submitted to tribute so that now their inhabitants cultivate their fields and their land in peace. But you had rather the tide of hunger without submitting to tribute? Now, the citizens were reluctant. Now, they agreed to offer tribute, yes, but concerned that her desire for revenge over the murder of her husband in their city might still lie behind her seeming kindness. But she reassured them. Her desire for revenge had been sated by her killing of the delegates sent to Kiev and the funeral feast massacre. She had had enough of killing, it was over. She desired peace. But she asked for a gesture from the people of Iskor-Rostan. A little thing, really, just a silly, small little gesture to show their acceptance of her offer. The buildings were roofed with straw, and birds found the roofs, of course, to be ideal nesting places. So she asked for 3 sparrows and 3 pigeons from each house in the city. Birds? She wants birds? Well, the people were surprised, but grateful at such a rather silly and seemingly meaningless request. She wanted a few birds. Well, that was a small price to pay for the end of the siege. Bit awkward catching them, to be sure, but well worth the effort, and they agreed. Crates filled with birds being handed over to the Rus forces around the city. The people were delighted. The war was over. Peace at last. All is well. Yes, but of course, this was Grand Princess Olga they were dealing with. The tale of bygone days stated, now Olga gave to each soldier in her army a pigeon or a sparrow, and ordered them to attach by thread to each pigeon and sparrow a piece of sulphur bound with small pieces of cloth. When night fell, Olga bade her soldiers release the pigeons and the sparrows. So the birds flew to their nests, the pigeons to the cots, and the sparrows under the eaves. The dovecots, the coops, the porches, and the haymows were set on fire. There was not a house that was not consumed, and it was impossible to extinguish the flames, because all the houses caught on fire at once. The people fled from the city, and Olga ordered her soldiers to catch them. Thus she took the city and burned it, and captured the elders of the city. Some of the other captives she killed, while some she gave to others as slaves to her followers. The remnant she left to pay tribute. She probably didn't get very much tribute since everything in the city had been destroyed, but finally she was satisfied. She had avenged her beloved husband, and she could now return to Kiev and continue to rule the realm as Grand Princess Regent for her son, backed up by the loyalty of the army and the genuine support of the people. She later travelled through the Drevlian land she had conquered, accompanied, we are told, by young Svatoslav, no doubt giving the boy some valuable tips about, royal problem solving. But she was on a peaceful mission this time, making sure all understood her laws and arranging tribute, as well as setting up hunting reserves and numerous trading posts. She continued this work right across the kingdom, establishing trading posts that became useful administrative centres. Many of these posts were set on rivers to improve access to trade, which of course benefited both the realm and the people. She set up border posts that helped to establish proper, easily recognised national boundaries to her realm, establishing the first recognised border between Rus and Poland, for example. No longer could any transgressors in her realm just say, I'm sorry, we didn't know that stream back there was your border. Your border. Sorry, won't happen again. No, she took care of that. She set up considerable fortifications too, all along her southern borders, to ward off any attempted invasions by the nomadic tribes from the east. And this also helped to bring increased trade, people feeling safer in the land of the Rus. She invested huge sums of money in improving all aspects of the infrastructure of her realm, and she reformed the outdated and unfair system of tribute that had applied previously, where local officials and their tribute collectors had been able to change the amount of tribute randomly. They just decided from day to day what you were going to pay. Let me see, you used to pay 3 goats, 2 cows, and a dozen chickens. Well, from now on it's 5 goats, 6 cows, and 2 dozen chickens. Pay up or off with your head. No, Olga got rid of that. Her reform meant that the payments were now fixed. They couldn't be manipulated by unscrupulous or greedy officials. The first properly organized taxation system in the Rus Empire. And the various cities themselves had the responsibility of collecting it and bringing it to special collection centers from where it would be sent on to Kiev. That was actually the first recorded legal reform anywhere in Eastern Europe, and it added to the increasing prosperity of her realm. The collection centres also became courts. Government officials operated from them, and these helped her to form a solid, centralised rule that had been lacking previously, Kiev's control over the realm having been somewhat disjointed. One great benefit of the new wealth from her reforms was in architecture. Great stone buildings beginning to replace the wooden, thatched buildings that had predominated previously. Kiev itself becoming renowned for its beautiful buildings, many of which actually can still be seen today. She influenced every aspect of life in her realm, and it could truthfully be said that she left it better than she found it. Even when her son was of age to rule and took the throne, she retained great power, ruling in his absence when he left on various military expeditions, which he did rather frequently. Even when he was there, she probably was the one who actually dealt with the everyday running of the country, since he was well known to have little liking for administrative duties. He was a soldier, and a good one, and he spent most of his time attacking things elsewhere, leaving his mother to attend to boring, humdrum, everyday things like ruling the realm, knowing, of course, that it was in very good hands, probably better hands than his, actually. He was greatly respected by his men. He lived like they did. He didn't bring a fancy tent as other rulers did, but he slept with his soldiers just the way they did, lying down on a horse blanket with a saddle for a pillow. As Olga ruled the empire, Sviatoslav extended Kiev's authority to the Volga, opening up the Volga trade route that had been dominated by the Khazars, destroying the Khazar city of Sarkel, and then doing the same to their capital, Atil. One writer saying that after he left, no grape or raisin remained, not a leaf on a branch. He opened trade routes to the Black Sea, and he was responsible for far greater Slavic settlement in the lands he subjugated. During one of his campaigns, Olga actually had to oversee the defense of the city during the siege of Kiev in 968 AD, though the strain of that seems to have affected her health, as we shall see. She was an old woman, of course, by then, at least 70 years old. She remained a widow to the end of her life, though she was frequently sought by members of the nobility, offering her their hand in marriage, but she rejected such advances. She had no desire for marriage, remaining true to the memory of her murdered husband. I must say I admire her for that. It showed a very nice love for him. And in fact, everything about her suggests a very fine woman and a superb ruler, albeit with the capability for great anger if pushed to the brink. You know, I see a bit of David Banner in her, aka the Incredible Hulk, and I can almost hear her say, "Don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry." No, you wouldn't. She might not turn green and her clothes fall off, but you would be left in no doubt as to her displeasure with you. Olga was, as I've said, a pagan to begin with, a devoted follower of the old gods of her Scandinavian homeland and the Slavic deities. But Christianity was gaining popularity across Europe during the 10th century. And sometime after 950 AD, she travelled to Constantinople, capital of the mighty Byzantine Empire, there to meet with Emperor Constantine VII. And while there, she was converted to the Christian faith, supposedly by the emperor himself, we are told. That put her at great odds with her son, since Sviatoslav still faithfully followed the old gods, and he strongly disapproved of his mother's conversion, though he cared about her, obviously, and he made no attempt to stop her or to punish her, nor did he interfere with her subsequent efforts to convert the Rus people, which as Grand Prince, of course, he could have done very easily. She was still Grand Princess, but he was now the ruler. The tale of bygone years went into some detail about Olga's conversion, the first ruler, of course, of the Kievan Rus to accept the new faith, and it positively gushed over her later work to spread Christianity to her people, stating that she shone like the moon by night, and she was radiant among the infidels like a pearl in the mire, since the people were soiled and not yet purified of their sin by holy baptism. I think it rather liked her, actually. On her meeting with the emperor, it had this to say: Olga came before him, and when he saw that she was very fair of countenance, and wise as well, the emperor wondered at her intellect. He conversed with her, and remarked that she was worthy to reign with him in the city. When Olga heard his words, she replied that she was still a pagan, and that if he desired to baptize her, he should perform this function himself. Otherwise, she was unwilling to accept baptism. The emperor, with the assistance of the patriarch, accordingly baptized her. At her baptism, she was christened Helena, after the ancient empress, mother of Constantine the Great. The patriarch then blessed her and dismissed her. Well, clearly Constantine had joined the multitude of men who desired to marry her. He obviously admired her physical beauty as well as her intellect, and a marriage to her, of course, would bring him considerable control over the Rus as well. But he underestimated her intelligence, much as he may have admired it, and she very cleverly outwitted him without causing him offence, making him the one responsible for her refusal to accept his proposal. And that's a neat trick if you can do it. Her desire for baptism was twofold. Yes, she wanted to convert to the new faith, but she also quite deliberately used it to forestall his marriage proposal, something that is clearly stated in the tale of bygone years. She asked the emperor to baptize her because under the rules of the church, their spiritual link would make any sexual relations between them a form of spiritual incest. It is stated, after her baptism, the emperor summoned Olga and made known to her that he wished her to become his wife. But she replied, "How can you marry me after yourself baptizing me and calling me your daughter? For among Christians that is unlawful, as you yourself must know." Then the emperor said, "Olga, you have outwitted me." He gave her many gifts of gold, silver, silks, and various vases, and dismissed her, still calling her his daughter. Yes, now it is possible that the tale was embellished a bit. The emperor was actually married at the time, but we really don't know how much is true and how much was added. But something happened seems likely, but exactly what is open to question. I mean, nobility were not always faithful to their marital vows, not by a long way. We have no idea if he might have wanted a different empress, or actually desired her more as a mistress than a wife, if he just fancied a quickie, a one-night stand, so to speak, or if he never mentioned it at all. But she just saw he was interested in her by the way he looked at her, and she used the baptism to prevent anything going any further. There are conflicting accounts of the date of her baptism as well. Some sources say 957 in Constantinople, while accounts from that city claim she had been baptized previously in Kiev in 955 and only took her baptismal name, Helena, after a second visit to Constantinople. We take a pick. Nor was she the first Rus to convert, of course. There had even been Christians in Igor's service back in 945 AD, but she was the first person of any importance to do so. And a person of very great importance, her rank as Grand Princess, gave a huge boost to those who supported the new faith. But whatever about her meeting with the emperor, the account of her return to Kiev and her unsuccessful attempts to persuade her son to follow her example and subsequent events do seem to be pretty accurate. It states that, now Olga dwelt with her son Sviatoslav, and she urged him to be baptized, but he would not listen to her suggestion, though when any man wished to be baptized, he was not hindered, but only mocked. Now, she argued with her son, saying that if he were to convert, his men would follow his example. They respected him, and they would follow suit because he had done it. But he replied that they would just laugh at him. They would see him as weak if he abandoned the strong Slavic gods, gods suited to warriors, in favour of the, well, clearly weak, turn the other cheek and love everybody god of the Christians. Soldiers, they wouldn't think much of that. There was a great deal of hostility, you see, towards Christians among the Rus, although it didn't seem to result in any great violence against them, in stark contrast to the way Christians usually treated pagans. And of course, Sviatoslav was well aware of that national feeling. He was opposed to Christianity himself, very much opposed to it. But we must give him great credit. Not only did he clearly care very much about his mother, but he was also obviously a fair-minded and quite tolerant man. And he promised her that he would not attempt to hinder her new beliefs, nor to persecute any who might convert to those beliefs. His decision undoubtedly hastened the ultimate conversion of the Rus, unhindered as it was by royal interference, though it wouldn't be until the year 988 that the new faith finally gained the upper hand, with the acceptance of it by Olga's grandson, Grand Prince Vladimir the Great. Olga took ill soon after the siege of Kiev in 969. As I said, she was an old woman by that time, being at least 70 years old, and probably a lot older if she was born in the year we think she was. And it's possible the strain of the siege had taken its toll on her. Sensing that her end was near, she begged Sviatoslav, who had just told her he was going off to the Danube, to stay with her during her last days, which he did. And 3 days later, on the 11th of July, she died, greatly mourned by relatives and people alike. The tale of bygone years tells it thus. Sviatoslav announced to his mother and his boyars, I do not care to remain in Kiev, but should prefer to live in the Preoslavets on the Danube, since that is the centre of my realm, where all riches are concentrated, gold, silk, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, and from Rus, furs, wax, honey, and slaves. But Olga made reply, You behold me in my weakness. Why do you desire to depart from me? For she was already in precarious health. She thus remonstrated with him, and begged him first to bury her, and then go wheresoever he would. 3 days later, Olga died. Her son wept for her with great mourning, as did likewise her grandsons and all the people. Thus they carried her out and buried her in her tomb. Olga had given command not to hold a funeral feast for her, for she had a priest who performed the last rites over the sainted princess. Thus passed one of the greatest rulers of the 10th century. Although still opposed to his mother's faith, Sviatoslav granted her request and allowed her personal priest, one Father Gregory, to perform the Christian burial rites, and the pagan funeral feast was not held, as Olga had asked. She lay in Kiev until her tomb was destroyed by Batu Khan and his Mongol Tartar army in the year 1240. Grand Prince Sviatoslav must have felt that for all her efforts to spread her faith, building churches, for example, all around the country, despite the opposition of many of her people, his mother's efforts had all been in vain. Rus attitudes to Christianity would never change. I'm sure he must have taken some satisfaction from that, despite his great feelings for his mother, though he could never have imagined how the eventual fulfillment of her desire would come about, nor the one who would bring it. He died in 972 AD, ambushed as he returned from one of his frequent campaigns. And he was succeeded as Prince of Novgorod by his son Vladimir, who was illegitimate, conceived actually by Sviatoslav's housekeeper, and himself also a pagan, while Kiev went to his legitimate son, Yaropolk, as Sviatoslav had decreed. But in 976, Yaropolk and a younger brother named Oleg, Sviatoslav's second son, who ruled the Drevlians, began a war over who ruled what. And in 977, Oleg was killed, while Vladimir was forced to flee to Scandinavia. Once there, he got the assistance of King Håkon Sigurdsson of Norway, returning to Kiev with an army and taking the throne. He went on to unify the Rus realm right across modern-day Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine to the Baltic Sea. And in 988, he finally abandoned his devotion to the Slavic gods and embraced Christianity, and by decree making it the religion of all the Rus, thus fulfilling his grandmother's dream of a Christian Rus nation. Though she had not herself actually brought it about, Olga's groundwork had undoubtedly been the cause of it, aided considerably by her son's decision not to oppose her, which was probably the pivotal point of the spread of the new faith across what would become Russia. Without Olga and Sviatoslav, the conversion of the Rus would have taken considerably longer, and the church rewarded her for her efforts. In 1547, almost 600 years after her death, she was declared a saint by the Russian Orthodox Church, her feast day being July the 11th, the date of her death. And appropriately, I suppose, she is the patron saint of widows and converts. And she was further honoured with the title Isapostolus, meaning equal to the apostles, given her efforts to spread the faith. That is how she is specifically referred to by the Eastern Orthodox Church, as well as the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church, and St. Olga is venerated by all the churches who use the old Byzantine Rite, which includes the Russian and Greek Orthodox, as well as the Greek Catholic Church, and also the Roman Catholic Church of Russia, who use the Latin Rite. So, how should the Grand Princess of Kiev be remembered today? This is, at first sight, strange woman who was by turns loving wife, caring and efficient ruler, bloodthirsty killer, warrior princess, and holy saint, devoted to the Norse and Slavic gods, and then a passionate follower of a faith from distant Palestine. A seemingly unlikely combination, a sort of amalgam of Mother Teresa, Xeno warrior princess, and Cersei Lannister. Well, she deserves her place in history. She should be remembered as both a great woman and a great ruler, one of the greatest rulers, in fact, in 10th century Europe, and she is sadly overlooked. Just the fact that a woman could rule over what would become Russia and hold such power in the 10th century is remarkable in itself. She governed well, from what we can determine. Her people certainly enjoyed far greater prosperity under her rule than previously, and she was liked by them. She was a popular ruler, and she brought many improvements and benefits to her realm, and that is undeniable. I see a parallel between her and Boadicea. Both became rulers of their people on the death of their husbands. Both were not cruel or vindictive as such, but suffered life-changing events. In Boadicea's case, it was the Romans ignoring her father's will that left her his kingdom, taking the kingdom from her, taking her property, and publicly raping and flogging her and her daughters. While Olga suffered the murder of her husband, and the incredible and humiliating insult of having the man who murdered him propose to her. In both women, their respective trauma ignited a rage that prompted them to actions I'm sure neither of them could ever have imagined doing. That may not justify their subsequent actions. Of course it didn't, but it makes them understandable. And in Olga's case, it was a temporary reaction that subsided once her revenge had been accomplished. It did not scar her for life and leave her cruel and brutal ever afterwards, ready to use similar brutality against anyone and everyone. There is nothing to suggest that she ever responded to anything with similar methods during the rest of her reign. She never burned anybody alive, nor did she burn any cities if they displeased her, while there is evidence that she had ruled fairly and was liked by her people, which would, of course, not have been the case if she had killed a lot of them, especially if she set them on fire. Boadicea, of course, well, she never got the chance to show how she might have ruled afterwards, since she died not long after being defeated by the Roman legions. Unfortunately, of course, the vast majority of those who fell victim to both women were completely innocent of any wrongdoing. The 100,000 or more Roman men, women, and children slaughtered by Boadicea had done nothing whatever. Neither had the thousands killed by Olga. Only a handful deserved what she did to them, just as only the Roman tax collector and a few of his men deserved Boadicea's revenge. But a pent-up rage like that felt by both women doesn't stop to pick and choose, I'm afraid. As I said at the start, it is unfortunate that usually when she is mentioned, it is only her violence that is highlighted. The killer saint, and such like titles given to her, and everything else about her is ignored. Nor is it pointed out that her violence was a once-off response to a particular circumstance that was not repeated, while her actions were certainly reprehensible. And I'm sure bird lovers would not look too kindly on her for obvious reasons. They do not really represent her true character, as is shown by the fact that she never resorted to similar methods again and was a popular ruler. Extreme violence was not an inherent part of her nature, as it was, say, in the case of Tamerlane, the great Mongol warlord who slaughtered literally millions of people during his reign. Violence was simply his nature, his response to any and all situations being to exterminate everyone who didn't see it his way, which was pretty much everybody he ever had dealings with. Her image as a warrior princess, well, yes, that's deserved, though there is no evidence that she ever actually fought with a weapon in her hand. She was the commander of the army. She led it to battle. She directed it very successfully, as it happens. So her status should be seen as that of a general, a commander, one who led her men, like Napoleon or the Duke of Wellington, neither of whom ever actually fought anybody hand to hand, though they are regarded as great warriors and Obviously, they faced danger on the battlefield, as is evidenced by Lord Uxbridge, sitting on his horse beside the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo and having his leg partly ripped off by a cannonball, which, of course, could just as easily have struck the Duke sitting beside him. As a little humorous note, to cheer things up a bit, since there's been rather a lot of very dark things in this video, Lord Uxbridge, very British and stiff upper lip, don't you know, was said to have turned to Wellington and said, "By God, sir, I've just lost my leg." Wellington looked down and said, "By God, sir, so you have." Well, that's the story anyway. Anyway, to return to Olga. As an inspiration for girls, a feminist icon, if you like, a female figure from history who showed that women can be equal to and sometimes better than men, well, yes, I would definitely place her along with Joan of Arc, inspiring the armies of France, with Ethelfled of Mercia, leading her army into the Danelaw, or Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, marching on foot with her soldiers to show solidarity with them. Her rule was more peaceful and better than that of many of her contemporaries, and she consolidated and strengthened the Rus territory with considerable efficiency and great intelligence. And it must be said that her love for her husband was beautiful. It was a beautiful love story, refusing all offers of marriage after his death, even if that love did result in mass carnage for a period of her reign, though I suppose that in itself demonstrated the depth of her feelings for him. Drevlians might not have seen the beauty of that, of course, though I'm sure Igor would have been touched had he seen his wife slaughtering her way through them on his behalf. Her greatness, I think, is well deserved. To misquote William Shakespeare, she bestrode Rus and the future Russia like a colossus. In 1997, she was honored by the Ukrainian government when, by presidential decree, they established the Order of Princess Olga, to be bestowed on women for, as the citation puts it, personal merits in state, production, scientific, educational, cultural, charity, and other spheres of social activities, for upbringing children in families. And both Ukrainian citizens and foreigners are actually eligible to receive the order, which comes in 3 classes, first, second, and third. The first class one being a gold medallion with 4 rectangular amethysts, one at each compass point, and an image of the saint at the center, with her bident emblem displayed on the ribbon the medallion is attached to. Now, I don't know if it inspired the Ukrainians in 1997 or if it was just a coincidence, and the latter seems unlikely, but there had been an imperial Russian order very similar to it, known as the Insignia of St. Olga, established by order of Tsar Nicholas II in February of 1913, but it wasn't officially approved until July of 1915. To commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. But it was only ever awarded once. The order swept away by the Russian Revolution, along with everything else connected with the Tsarist regime. It was designated as an award intended only for women. Quote, in consideration of the merits of women in the various arenas of public and community service, as well as to the deeds and works for the benefit of their neighbors. It came in 3 grades, the same as the 1997 one, hardly perhaps a coincidence, its purpose being so similar as well. I'm sure the Ukrainian one was inspired by the Tsarist order. And it was intended to have the dates of the Romanov Empire's anniversary inscribed. February 21st day, 1613, 1913. It was designated for 3 grades of merit. Grade 1, a gold and light blue enameled Byzantine cross, worn on the left shoulder, suspended from a white bow. Grade 2, a silver and light blue enameled Byzantine cross, worn on the left shoulder, suspended from a white bow. Grade 3, a smaller, plain silver Byzantine cross, but yeah, you get it. It was only supposed to be awarded twice each year, on the 23rd of April, which was the birthday of Tsarina Alexandra, and on the 14th of November, the birthday of the Dowager Tsarina Maria. But due in part to the delays of actually implementing the thing, the award was only ever given once, to a woman named Vera Panayeva, a widow who had lost 3 of her sons during the war. Though usually referred to as the Order of St. Olga, its official title was actually the Insignia of the Holy Saint Princess Olga. But we're not quite finished with orders dedicated to Olga, since the Moscow Patriarchate had its own decoration for women. The Order of St. Olga is Apostolus, the Order of St. Olga, equal of the Apostles, which again comes in differing classes. the first-class award being reserved for female heads of state, the first to receive it being Varia Freiberger, the President of Latvia. So that concludes this look at Grand Princess Olga, loving wife, mother, grieving widow, mighty ruler, avenging warrior, organizer, benefactor, saint, a woman of many attributes, most of them very good, one quite beautiful, and another bordering on the horrific. A woman who earned her place on the pages of history, a woman who deserves to be remembered far more than she usually is, and remembered correctly. A remarkable and powerful figure, one who improved her country and brought benefits to her subjects, not just as a sadistic and vengeful person with a rather kinky taste in revenge. That misinformed image is not the real Grand Princess Olga. However you view her, she was magnificent. She well deserves the monuments to her that can be seen in the Ukraine today. There is a particularly fine statue of her that can be seen in the city of Kiev. So, with that, I suppose all that remains is for me to say farewell, goodbye, until next time. I hope you enjoyed.